He walked into asylums carrying a tool that looked like an ice pick. Because it basically was one. In under 10 minutes, sometimes less than 5, he could go from a man's eye socket straight into his brain and scramble the part of him that made him, him. He did this over and over, thousands of times. Hospitals across America invited him in like he was a traveling preacher. Newspapers loved him. Families thanked him. And the man whose idea started all of it? He won the Nobel Prize. This is the story of the lobotomy, the cure that hollowed out thousands of human beings, made one doctor world famous, and left medicine with a stain it still hasn't fully washed out. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to 1935, to a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz. Moniz wasn't some fringe figure. He was respected. He'd already pioneered a technique for imaging blood vessels in the brain. But mental illness in the 1930s was a different problem entirely. Asylums were overflowing. There were no real treatments, just restraint, isolation, and time. Moniz had a theory. Severe mental illness came from faulty connections in the front of the brain. If you could sever those connections, maybe you could sever the illness from the person carrying it. So he tried it. He called the procedure a leucotomy. Drill 2 holes into the skull, reach in with a thin wire loop, and core out small sections of the frontal lobe. He had no real way of knowing what those connections actually did. He just had a theory, a handful of willing patients, and a complete absence of long-term data. His first surgical subjects showed some calming of symptoms. That was enough. He published, he moved on. He never personally tracked what happened to most of those patients years later. An American neurologist was watching from across the Atlantic. His name was Walter Freeman, and he saw something in Moniz's rough idea that the rest of the medical world hadn't quite grasped yet: potential. In 1936, Freeman teamed up with neurosurgeon James Watts and performed the first lobotomy, that's the name Freeman gave it, in the United States. The patient was a housewife from Kansas named Alice, struggling with depression and insomnia. The night before the operation, she tried to back out. She was frightened about having her head shaved. Freeman simply told her he wouldn't shave it. He talked her back into the chair. The surgery went ahead. It was the first of what would become thousands. For nearly a decade, Freeman and Watts worked as a team, drilling into skulls under at least some surgical conditions: an operating room, anesthesia, a trained neurosurgeon at the controls. Then, in 1945, everything changed. Freeman heard about a faster technique developed in Italy. Skip the drill entirely. Go in through the eye socket. He adapted it himself, and it became known as the Transorbital lobotomy. Lift the eyelid, slide a thin metal spike, in his early demonstrations a literal ice pick from his kitchen, up against the bone above the eyeball. Tap it through with a small hammer. Push it into the frontal lobe. Wiggle it side to side, severing the connections behind it. Done. No surgeon required, no operating room required. Freeman could do this in a doctor's office, in a hospital hallway, in the back of a van. And that's exactly what he did. Freeman bought a camper, customized it, and started driving across the country performing the procedure on dozens of patients per stop. Reporters nicknamed it the Lobotomobile. In one 2-week stretch in West Virginia alone, he performed over 200 transorbital lobotomies, a project the press dubbed Operation Ice Pick. He treated it like theater. Colleagues described him as a showman who'd sometimes perform the procedure on both eyes at once, hammer in each hand, in front of an audience of watching doctors, partly to prove how fast and simple it was. By the end of his career, Freeman had personally performed an estimated 3,500 lobotomies. Factor in the doctors he trained and the patients treated under procedures he popularized, and some estimates push that number toward 5,000. Nearly 500 of his patients died as a direct result of the surgery. Here's where the story takes its strangest, darkest turn. Back in 1944, Years before his transorbital method even existed, Freeman did something almost nobody expected. He personally nominated his mentor, Antonio Egas Moniz, for the Nobel Prize. 5 years later, in 1949, it worked. Moniz won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for inventing the lobotomy. Think about the timing. The same decade that award was handed out, a 23-year-old named Rosemary Kennedy, sister of a future American president, underwent a lobotomy meant to ease her mood swings. It left her permanently incapacitated, unable to fully walk or speak normally for the rest of her life. Her family kept her hidden away for decades. She wasn't an outlier. Historians estimate that roughly 2 out of every 3 lobotomy patients in this era were women. Many institutionalized not for psychosis, but for depression, anxiety, or simply behavior their families found difficult to control. And the man who turned Moniz's idea into a nationwide phenomenon, who personally lobotomized thousands of people with a sharpened tool from his own kitchen, never faced serious professional consequences. He kept practicing for decades. So what was actually happening inside these patients' heads? The frontal lobe isn't extra tissue you can just scoop out. It's where personality lives. Planning, empathy, impulse control, the sense of being yourself. Sever its connections, and people didn't get better. They got quieter, compliant, flattened. Doctors at the time called this success. A patient who used to scream was now silent. A patient who used to fight the staff now sat still for hours at a time. Almost nobody stopped to ask whether silent and still was the same thing as healed. It wasn't until the 1950s, when a new drug called chlorpromazine offered an actual chemical way to manage psychiatric symptoms, that lobotomies finally began to fade. Not because the medical establishment admitted it had been wrong, because something cheaper, faster, and less permanently destructive came along. Today, the Nobel Committee has faced repeated calls to revoke Moniz's prize. They've refused every time. The award still stands, more than 70 years later, as one of the most controversial decisions in the prize's entire history. Walter Freeman died in 1972, still defending his work, still convinced he'd helped more people than he'd harmed. Thousands of people walked into those rooms as whole human beings. Most of them never walked out the same again. If this story shocked you, hit subscribe, because next time, we're uncovering the doctor whose cure killed more patients than the disease it was supposed to treat.